Glasgow has just hosted COP26, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. At time of recording, world leaders have pledged to reduce methane emissions, phase down coal, and halt deforestation in a bid to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And in the middle of that was Australia, one of the most carbon-intensive countries on the planet, screwing it up for the rest of us.
This is somewhat surprising. Australia has huge amounts of renewable resources, a particularly vulnerable climate, and strong public support for climate action. Nevertheless, Australia has an international reputation for sabotaging climate talks, going back more than 20 years. It all started in 1997 at Kyoto during the third conference of the parties. This was the first international agreement to try and reduce greenhouse gases on a global scale. It was an overwhelming success, or a complete failure, or both, depending on how you look at it. Here's how the Kyoto Agreement works. Each participating country took the amount of carbon they emitted in 1990, their base year. They then made a commitment to reduce that by a certain percentage between 2008 and 2012, and then later on by another percentage between 2013 and 2020. The United Kingdom, for example, pledged to reduce their carbon emissions by 13 and 20% respectively. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist. Now, at the time of Kyoto, the Australian government had what they called a no-regrets climate policy. This meant that they weren't willing to take action on climate change if they thought it would hurt mining, or agriculture, or industry, electricity prices, standard of living. You get the idea. So when the Australian delegation arrived at Kyoto, they weren't actually trying to lower their carbon emissions, they wanted to get away with raising them. Now, the first tactic they used was pretty simple. Australia just flat out said that they were going to increase their carbon emissions for the first commitment period by 8%. So this is clearly not great, but it actually gets a lot worse. The Australian negotiators also inserted this clause into Article 3, Section 7 of the Kyoto Protocol, which covers land use change, and forestry. The Australia Clause, as it's now known, doesn't affect the Kyoto commitment periods, but rather the base year that they're compared to. It says that a country with high levels of deforestation in 1990 can count those as carbon emissions. This was important to Australia for a very simple reason. In 1990, Australia chopped down a lot of trees. By adding this one amendment, the Australian negotiating team increased Australia's base year emissions by somewhere between 30 and 40%. So, if Australia just stopped chopping down trees, they'll be able to massively increase their carbon emissions while still being well within their Kyoto commitments. Now, on the surface, this doesn't sound too bad. After all, saving forests is good for the environment, right? Well, the problem is that land use emissions are inherently different to fossil fuel emissions, which is why most climate graphs don't even include them. Land use change, and forestry is part of what's referred to as the active carbon cycle, carbon moving from the soil to the atmosphere to the ocean, and vice versa. This is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on, but it's not the main driver behind climate change. Climate change is happening because we've been taking dormant carbon in the form of fossil fuels and adding them to the carbon cycle by burning them. Reducing our land use emissions won't solve climate change. It will be an important tool in achieving net zero in the short term. We haven't unlocked zero carbon alternatives for some of our industries just yet, but it's not a long-term solution. Apart from anything else, sequestered carbon from land use is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, as we've tragically seen over the last few years. All of this was known back in 1997 at Kyoto, and that's why, when the Australians added the Australia Clause to the Kyoto Protocol, they did so surreptitiously, on the last day of the conference at 2 a.m. in the morning, and without handing out hard copies, in a successful bid to have it passed without the proper level of scrutiny. As one Australian negotiator said afterwards, they, the other parties, began to work out what had happened, but by then it was too late. This gambit paid off massively for the Australian government. During the first commitment period, Australia's carbon emissions rose by around 30% over their 1990 levels. But thanks to the Australia Clause, it looked like carbon emissions were basically the same. In fact, recent data provided by the Australian government argues that they went down, actually. And so now we move on to the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. By this point, the second Kyoto commitment period was well underway. Australia's pledge was still significantly less than other countries, but it was an actual reduction this time, of 0.5%. Okay, we need to talk about maths for a second. Under the Kyoto Protocol, when you make a commitment to reduce your carbon emissions, that's taken as an average over the entire commitment period. So it doesn't matter how much carbon you actually emit in any given year, as long as the total number is smaller than the area under this line. So by that metric, Australia's pledge for the second commitment period was 0.5%. However, you'll see a lot of Australian politicians talking about a 5% reduction. What they're doing is changing the line. Instead of a flat line, it's now a slope, starting at 108%, the amount that we were allowed to emit in 2010, going down to 95% in 2020. So the area under this line is the same as the area under this one, but it lets politicians say a 5% reduction instead of a 0.5% reduction, which sounds a lot better. Alright, back to Paris. It was starting to look like Australia might actually have to enact some policies to achieve their targets, which the government still did not want to do. So instead, the Australian negotiators came up with a new loophole. Since Australia had done so well during the first commitment period, they argued, surely Australia should be able to carry that surplus into the second commitment period as carbon credits, right? This was a hard sell at Paris, where parties were being asked to pledge their highest possible ambition, and relying on an accounting trick from 2 decades previously was not that. Nevertheless, Australia once again got its way, however this time with a few strings attached. The Kyoto carryover credits, as they're now called, could only be used for the second commitment period, and only if they were needed. If the Kyoto Protocol continued after that, those carryover credits would not. The Kyoto Protocol is now over. Whether you consider it a success or a failure, it has been replaced by the much broader Paris Climate Agreement, under which Australia has pledged to reduce its carbon emissions by at least 26% by 2030, although that's below 2005 levels, not 1990 ones. The problem is that this is an almost unachievable goal given Australia's current policies. It looked like the government's original plan was to meet their targets by using the carryover credits from the Kyoto commitment periods, despite the fact that this was specifically not allowed. In the face of overwhelming legal criticism, the Australian government finally abandoned this idea, which they then managed to spin as positive climate action. That brings us to 2021, and the question now is, have things changed? Well, first we need to address the elephant in the room. Climate change in Australia is a deeply partisan issue. When the current opposition were last in power, between 2007 and 2013, some progress was made. Several policies were enacted which had started to reduce Australia's carbon emissions by the 2013 election. The winner of that election, however, was a climate denier who ran on a platform of abolishing the most visible of those carbon mitigation policies. And even though he was replaced as Prime Minister soon after, in the 8 years since, the government has systematically dismantled most of Australia's successful climate change policies and put fossil fuel executives in charge of the rest. And while the current Prime Minister is arguably not a climate denier, that position has become much less palatable after the Black Summer bushfires, his government is still moving in the wrong direction. The messaging about climate change has evolved over the last 25 years, but the no regrets climate policy is still very much in place. So what can we do to fix this? Well, the good news is that the solution is quite straightforward. Vote. The governing coalition is relying on the fact that although a significant majority of Australians want action on climate change, they don't seem to want it enough to change who they vote for. And unfortunately, that means the opposition has learned that ambitious climate goals don't get them elected. But that can change. If elections start being won by the party promising to do more about the climate, Australia can become the leader that so many people want it to be. The 2020s are being called the decisive decade. We have a very small window where we can avoid the worst effects of a warming planet. If the party promising the most climate action wins for the next 3 elections, then Australia will, for the first time in 25 years, finally be doing its part.